So what is Relationship Anarchy not? This is part 3 of a book study of Relationship Anarchy, Occupy Intimacy by Juan-Carlos Pérez-Cortés. And we are finishing chapter 1. Of course, this is written by one person's perspective. You may have a different perspective. Maybe you want to share that as we talk about these ideas. You can get the book at relationshipanarchybook.com. So in this first exploration of privilege analysis, we're going to be looking at couple privilege. And so you'll see that in our current understanding of relationships, we have the couple is the primary relationship, the thing that has the most authority in people's lives, and also is legitimized by other people. So that's what he's going to be talking about here in the next section, is that the privilege of the couple is that it is recognized without further explanation, right? And it also holds inherent power within it. For example, the expectation of care. And so, like, if you are tied to somebody who ends up in the hospital, if you're a part of that couple, then you are given the privilege of being able to see them, right? They will ask, like, what is your relationship to this person? And if it's deemed legitimate, then you get to actually be a part of that care process. Or in the sense of respect. And you'll see this, especially with heterosexual cisgender men, will offer respect to a woman if he thinks that she is partnered with a man, right? And we see that women have to play into this for their own safety quite often, with that sense of how instead of saying no to someone who's maybe asking them out or offering them a drink or something, they have to say, hey, I have a boyfriend. So they have to put a man in between themselves and another man, even psychologically, for that to be respected. And then other things like the social value, which you'll see in how women are addressed, right? So are they addressed as a girl? Are they addressed as Miss, Mrs.? You have these different things that identify you in different ways and then put you in sort of the hierarchy of things, relationships. In our current society, we do have this sense of this understanding around how no, one person cannot possess another person, right? So even though there's couple privilege, that possessiveness aspect has been critically looked at even in just general society. And you'll see a lot of people pushing back against that these days. But even though we understand that there can be a toxic level of possessiveness within relationships, there might be other levels of entitlement that still seep into how we do relationships. So he has this quote here. I've been taught to believe that I'm entitled to give permission to those I have relationships with that are of a certain degree of intensity, to tell them, without any further consideration per the privilege I've acquired, that something they do bothers me, even when I am not there, to hold them responsible for my happiness, to know the details of their private lives, to blame them for my insecurities, jealousy, lacks, to tolerate their emotions and actions as long as they don't affect me too much, to insist that they understand my needs without me having to express them because they're determined by the norm. They should just know how to take care of a man or how to treat a woman, to get angry when something doesn't meet my expectations. I mentioned that before too, where I had that expectation for a long time in relationships, that it should just be known. I just shouldn't have to communicate it, until I realized how much that just doesn't work. And also I prefer more communication rather than less, or more straightforwardness. But it's very deeply ingrained in how we do relationships. For some, it's even a cultural thing, where maybe their subculture prefers more passive communication, and it's harder. You're left to sort of guess a lot. Then in others, maybe it's more direct. But there still may be, like, even beyond that though, I see him saying here that there's this sense that there's still a social norm that you're having to play into, right? Where you should just know, like, this is XYZ, how you treat a man, and this is how you treat a woman, right? And that you're just supposed to know that and follow that, whether you know it and agree with it or not. And so this is all part of that sort of the analysis of privileges and the couple's privilege. And then all the things inherent within that. Because even more than that last part, right? He was also talking about how once we are in a relationship with somebody, we then feel that entitlement to certain things. That, like, I get to just tell you when something bothers me. That I get to just know about all the different things in your private life. That I can blame you for me feeling insecure. Maybe something you do triggers the fact that I feel insecure about something. right? So it gets into how much we're putting sort of our own sense onto someone else. How much are we really owning that? Having that autonomy, which also includes maybe that like personal responsibility to my own self. And of course, there's that sense of, that doesn't mean you go and then say, well, I'm not responsible for anything that I do to somebody else or any way that they react about that or the impact. That's not what it is, right? We're not trying to go from one extreme to the other, because he's always promoting this sense that there's a middle ground, right? The analysis is to break down like what is going on and how much is really an expectation and entitlement, and how much is really a part of that mutual support that we're moving toward, coming from that place of self-management, that we have agreed upon this, that we're in communication, that we're actively seeking to create something that's uniquely ours, right? But it does take that sense of getting maybe a critical view or getting a sense of reflection on what's happening. And then he says down here, it's precisely those who are most vulnerable, individuals with less power and privilege, who could benefit the most from the shift from a society of atomized, nuclear, individualistic relationships to a system based on broad networks, where relationships are not subject to cultural mandates on being labeled and defined by anything other than the needs, desires, and capacities of their members, where reciprocity is not determined on an individual basis but between each person and the group. I'm curious to see what that would means. I'm sure in the next number of chapters he's going to go into like the practical vision of what this could be. So this part we've touched on numerous times because he's touched on it numerous times. But now we're getting specifically into that part around how relationship anarchy is not apolitical and not just individualistic. The neoliberal individualistic apolitical gaze, this would be the exact opposite point of view, tailoring the blueprint for relationship anarchy to hegemonic logic. It's common, almost universal, for any interest or successful approach to be swallowed up by the dominant dialectic, for a moderate, sugar-coated version to be woven into the common parlance of the day. That way, it poses less of a threat to the status quo. Then he says, the apolitical interpretation, which is always just as political as any other form, generally focuses on defending personal freedom, individualism, and upholding the entire capitalist, consumerist, objectifying, heteropatriarchal imaginary. So that's interesting, right? Is anything even apolitical? Because apolitical is political, he says. Well, because, in my understanding, it's usually based on the fact of having more privilege, right? Like, when you have more privilege, you can sort of pretend to be apolitical in a sense. You can put a blind eye to what is actually political. Doesn't mean it's not political, which I think is what he's saying, right? Like, it's still political. You're still operating within these systems, but you get to sort of ignore them. But that in of itself is political, right? But then he also says, materially, the concept of freedom is not usually used in its virtuous meaning of conscious, responsible autonomy, emancipation, and empowerment prevailing, but in the sense of freedom of the most powerful, and specifically exemption from commitment and responsibility over those who have less power. This clashes with the prevailing meaning in anarchist contexts, where the notion of freedom is examined, or should be examined, in a framework that closely tied to the collective aspect of the power dynamics. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. So, especially when someone is coming at it purely from an individualistic frame, then it is basically freedom because you have the most power to be free. And I really appreciate that later on he'll say, like, because you're using these words, but you're assuming everybody even has the same capacity to do that, right? Like, you are pretending that the playing field is even when it's not. And so then what is the freedom that you're talking about? And what is it standing upon? And then is it actually available to everybody? Or is that part of how we do this together, where we begin to create mutually beneficial, supportive structures that are actually taking into account the fact that we're not all on the same playing field? Or at least with the same shoes and equipment, or however you want to use this metaphor. This was actually where I said in a previous video that there was a vision of this that was written somewhere in this chapter that I really liked. And so he pulls an excerpt from a blog post on queer anarchism. Anarchism, to me, is very much about commitment, about building communities that reject the rules of capitalism, of ownership of jobs, of productive and unproductive members, of competition. Communities that instead choose care, cooperation, equality, acknowledgement that our differences make our strengths, and each to contribute according to their ability, to receive according to their need. And in that community, we make the rules that suit us and end them when they no longer suit our community. So relationship anarchy, then, to me, means community. A community of two or of many, a community that rejects the rules of relationships, of enforcing heterosexuality, enforced monogamy, of partners being entitled to sex, of marriage, of childcare being a two-person job, and of the idea that we need a romantic or sexual relationship to be complete. A community that instead chooses care, cooperation, equality, acknowledgement, that we are more than our relationship and that we all have different needs, and in that community we make the rules that suit us and end them when they no longer suit our community. I mean, sounds beautiful. Yes, it does sound beautiful. And part of what we're talking about here is looking, critically at how do we get there? Can we get there? And if we're going to be using this term, relationship anarchy, this philosophy, this practice, what is it not? So that is more of a vision of what it is. So then, what is it not? Because he says down here, the likely effect of a movement purporting to reject norms altogether is the invisible conservation of dominant norms from within and beyond that movement. So this is the tricky part, right? You have to both look at what it is and what it is not, because you have those embedded senses of norms that even if you're saying, okay, we're going to get rid of all the norms, you're still going to bring it in some way. It might come in sideways, some other way. Like, it's still kind of there if you're just saying, oh, we're not going to do that. Like, we're going to purport to reject all of these. But what is showing up then? And is it truly, beyond those norms? It is about the difficulty and considerable degree of commitment and dedication that the move to an anarchist relationship model entails for someone born and raised in a society where structural serial monogamy and patriarchal heterocentrism are not only dominant, but virtually the only widely available reference point. So not only is it a dominant message, but that's all that you even know how to reference, right? So now when you're getting outside of this, you're like, what is it then? How do you even do it? There's no other reference point that your mind has. That's why it becomes so easy to sort of blend back into what you know. It's truly overcoming the strong, deeply rooted emotions that inhabit the complex feeling of jealousy often requires work, discipline, and repeated failure. The same is needed to put the principle of having no authority and the agency of well-being of others on par with one's own needs for safety and comfort, or with the needs of one's crushes and loves. All these difficulties are real. They appear over and over on a daily basis in a non-normative relationship and practices. And he's going to get more into that in a later chapter. So he's saying not only is it your mind doesn't know what else to reference other than the norms that you were handed, but in those norms are deeply rooted emotions and sort of triggered ways of thinking that when this happens, I'm supposed to feel this, right? And we've patterned that over and over and over and over and over again and seen it over and over and over and over again. That when you begin to break out of that, you're going to have your same automatic reaction. And so it takes that dedication to sort of rewire the way that you're looking at relationships. And because even if you're thinking about them in this new way, you're still getting that message every day, right? So you're kind of going up against the stream, the river, to really show up to a different way of being. Expectations can be the most toxic, deconstructive, and complex ingredients in the entire cocktail of obstacles and impediments to a shift in relationship model. The danger of delegitimizing other counter-hegemonic models, which may still have more normative components or involve less ambitious or radical alternatives, is quite real and is often rears its head with negative consequences. So this is where, I think even in a previous video, we were talking about how relationship anarchy, yes, is not polyamory, it's not monogamy, it's sort of applicable to whatever the relationship model you want, but because it's a practice in philosophy about relationships. But there was that criticism of, if you are trying to deconstruct the supremacy of couples privilege, and even if you move into maybe from a monogamy point of view to a polyamorous one where you don't just have one couple, but you may have multiple ones, there was that criticism, or at least that point being made around, is it really liberating you past that, privilege, the privilege of the couple. And here he's saying, like, you can have that analysis, that criticism of, like, yes, you're liberating in one sense, but it's not fully moving beyond. But that doesn't mean you go then and delegitimize anything that's not like the fullest extent of liberation possible. Just because it hasn't doesn't mean that's not still valid and important, that it is liberating in some way. And even looking at monogamy, it's not saying that monogamy is bad, or that there's no liberation that can be found within that model. And so, right? So you can, I think he's also pushing against the idea that, like, sure, you can have this vision of how we could really all be liberated and emancipated from oppressive structures and systems and things, but you don't look back and point to people who are doing it different than you and saying, well, you're not the good version of liberation, right? But I'm the good version, or you're the bad version. Each individual decides to what extent they can or want to challenge social normality according to their interests, responsibilities, and circumstances. Because at the core of it, right, you are advocating for self-management, so you can't look to someone else and say you're not doing it right. Because now you are trying to impose your way of looking at it onto someone else and taking away their self-management. They get to decide what's right for them. And even if you are very 100% into, like, getting past all the social norms, okay, that doesn't mean that someone who says, actually, 20% here, 50% here, whatever works for me, that you need to be, right, deciding that that's good or bad. Presenting relationship anarchy as the good version of open relationships, swinging free love, polyamory, or consensual monogamy has a secondary effect of censorship or disapproval of those or other models that actually involve interesting disruptive processes that are very important. Any challenge to the universal criteria imposed by the norm is a valuable crack in the hegemonic structure that I believe must always be taken positively. Right? We're all about change. I think even to add to that, like someone doing monogamy in a liberated sense would count under that as well. Okay, now to actually get to what relationship anarchy is not, from his point of view, he says, in ideological terms, relationship anarchy is by no means a praise of individualism and freedom as a rejection of commitment and solidarity. So again, this is not hyper-individualism. This is not freedom without commitment or solidarity to an actual community. It isn't related to the liberal tradition, just as how the solution to low wages is not another side hustle, the answer to the problem of the normative couple as a bubble that isolates and prevents relationships from forming a network of support, care, and mutual understanding is not the freedom to multiply the bubbles, right? Relationship anarchy does not explicitly define affective sexual practices. It is therefore not a kind of ethical or consensual non-monogamy. Right, we said that a lot. So that's something that it's not. It is not just a kind of consensual or ethical non-monogamy. It is not about just bursting the bubble of the couple to multiple bubbles. It's a whole different sort of analysis of relationships. It's not a model that challenges the value of relationships and the importance of love and commitment. Nor does it underestimate the depth of feelings, passions, and emotions, the intimacy, trust, and union for mutual care, support, and love. Quite the opposite. It does not promote emotional individualism. It confronts it from the widest possible angle, right? So as we're doing this sort of analysis of relationships from RA, you're going at the widest possible angle. And he mentioned too, like, another reason why it's not just like another form of ethical non-monogamy is that it's not just about affective, emotional, romantic, or sexual relationships, which is what that model is about. It's not to delegitimize that model, but it is not another form of it because it's a much wider view of relationships in general. So as such, it's also not a cynical option to save oneself from disappointment, right? Like, it's not like saying, hey, I've been burned by relationships in the past, and so I'm just going to go RA, and I don't not have to care about anybody else anymore, or I don't have to really get into the messiness of relationships anymore. It's actually probably a lot messier in that sense, like emotionally and such, because he's talked about earlier how you're going to be confronted every day with your internalized messaging, with the emotions that are tied to that, with everything that's triggered by the fact that you're trying to do something that you don't have a map for, and that you have to actually self-determine your map. So that's going to feel probably messier than than even previous relationships, because you had the model, you were practicing it worked for a time and then it didn't work, right? Whatever. You had a blueprint to follow. You don't have a blueprint over here, not really. It's like you're standing at a road with all these different highways and streets, and you're looking at the sign. It says that, and you turn around and someone hands you like a machete. They just point to the bush and they're like, "Go make your own." You know, like feel into yourself. If you were literally standing at a signpost and it's got all these different ways, and some of them go down really interesting and blah blah blah. Some of them are really big, like highways. Everybody's going that way, except for some people. It's very clearly marked. There's cafes and everything over there. And then someone hands you a machete. It just says, "Go off into the wilderness." So that's how it could feel, I'm thinking. It's probably not like the most accurate analogy or metaphor or whatever. But you get that sense, right? You're going to be going into the field, into the woods, having to break through the brush, like, of all the different ways that you thought relationships were, because you're choosing something else. But you get to, you'll get a sense of how you want to practice, right? That doesn't mean that you'll never feel secure in how you're doing this, but it takes a lot, like he's saying. And there's probably all sorts of things that can come up over time. Then again, that's true of all relationships, Everybody thinks we have the map, but the reason we're even looking at this differently is because for a lot of people it doesn't work. Then he says, finally, relationship anarchy is not an extravagant fantasy that denies the fragility of those who have suffered or are suffering, either due to the structural violence of the construction of identities in the society or to personal violence of deprivation. It does not intend to leave them out of some superior, innovative model, or worse yet, harass and torment them on a daily basis for not being able to hang 10 in this fresh, groundbreaking, frothing wave of modernity. Jealousy, the need to feel special and unique, the feeling of abandonment in the face of loneliness, the difficulty of enjoying a chosen healthy retreat, overcoming feelings of helplessness, sadness, failure, rejection, those are not signs of bad behavior or awkwardness. They're not defects or indications of the lack of maturity or willpower to get better. They aren't flaws to be ashamed of for failing to live up to the expectation defined by some innovative cutting-edge doctrine. No. They are behaviors that require support and solidarity, basic principles of anarchist thought. So this is where, for me, it comes back to that sense of just knowing that you're human, that you're not. This isn't about taking on a philosophy and this cutting-edge way of looking at relationships, so that then you be held to this perfectionistic standard that you've decided this must look like, but dropping more into the fact that you're human, dropping more into the reality of your emotions that you're going to have. The messiness of relationship, the working out of it and communicating, that you might feel jealousy, or likely isolated or rejected. All these things are still your very human experiences that you'll still very much have. Turning sorrow into coercion is almost inevitable if there's no warning or an ever-present set of clear reference points. Relationship Anarchy's exact aim is to contribute to building that landmark, the beacon that's always visible, reminding us of the importance of fellowship and the danger of tyranny. Coercive dynamics aren't sustainable, and they end up hurting more than helping, or even turning into dangerous oppressions in the long term. And so that can even happen in the midst of a group of people that seek to practice a philosophy, right? Then you can begin to have those systems come in where maybe, even if unintended, there's this sense of, to do relationship anarchy, the best way, you have to almost be superhuman. And then he's saying, no, right? You're putting upon yourself, again, that oppressiveness of the should, how I should be doing this, rather than just being really present to, how can I do this now? How am I doing this now? How can I do this now? For me, I take it to mean, how much more can I show myself compassion and understanding, acceptance and curiosity around what's coming up as I move toward and just engage with this practice and be with whatever occurs, right? Within myself, in the outside world, in my relationships. that it's like, it comes back to what I originally suspected and thought this was about, which is inviting us to like such radical presence in the everyday moments with ourselves throughout the day, throughout the relationships, throughout, these changes and these invitations we're giving to ourselves to explore new ways of being. So, what is it not? Hyper individualistic. Saying that this is the best way and everything else is not liberating enough. It's not letting go of all commitments and understanding it outside of the idea of community, as well as your own personal experience. It's not just another form of ethical non-monogamy. And there's probably some others, whatever you heard me say prior to this that we touched on, right? And it's not about just leaving people behind. You can't do it right? That we're actually about including more people in community and supporting people at a deeper level, right? Because before, if it's just the privilege of the couple, but also the isolation of the couple, is that yes, you have each other's backs. This is your ride or die person, blah, blah, blah. But that's it. And there's not really a community of support, right? And that there's so much stress that's put on this relationship that it statistically cracks, right? The majority of the time. And then you're left behind, right? In a sense. But in this, it's like we're not putting a stress on the couple. We're breaking down this idea that this has to be how relationships are, or that this is the most valuable form of relationship. And we're really looking at all forms of relationships and building community on this much more expanded sense. So people aren't left behind. And what does that even mean, right? Your community gets to determine what moving forward is, right? In that sense of behind, forward. You get to decide, you get to agree upon what that is, right? And maybe it will look different than other communities. And that you are doing that with a sense of supporting each other. So yeah, okay. I mean, I'm still understanding this myself. But as I'm reading this, it's making a lot of sense in some ways. In more ways, I'm really curious about what comes next in this book. The next part talks about cultural historical perspective. I'm probably going to skip over that just for this online series. I encourage you to go get the book and read that part. Chapter 3 is I relate to others in a different way, labels, models, and practices. So let's get into the practical next time. And if it seems like we got to pull things from chapter 2, great. If not, then I just invite you to go get the book and read it. And yeah, so I didn't introduce myself. My name is Lux. Welcome to my channel. I called us Sovereign Adventurers right now. But yeah, we're exploring this topic, other topics. I might break up the videos of the book club with other things I just want to talk about. Just to keep it fun, because I want this channel, at least for my own self too, to be a fun experience. So as we're having fun with this book club, I might just bring in other thoughts and things, and you'll be seeing more videos soon about other things. So yeah, I'll see you here again very soon.